Join us in a festival that promises to be extraordinary, because Bali is extraordinary.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Ubud Readers and Writers Festival 2021. This year, the festival returns with the theme Mulat Sarira, self-reflection, which draws from the Balinese Hindu philosophy. From the 8th to the 17th of October, we're exploring the meaning of self-reflection, cultural introspection, and human rights, examining who we are, what unites and divides us, and what drives our actions. My name is Laura Hardy. I lead a design team here in Bali called Ibuku, creating spaces that connect us with nature, almost entirely out of bamboo historically, and more with other materials. And I'm fascinated by the natural world and landscapes and where we're going with it. I also, growing up in Bali, love this island and love islands, and our speaker today has written a book called Islands of Abandonment, which brings up so many interesting topics. It's about life in the post-human landscape. And she's traveled for a course of over 2 years to some extraordinary places that most of us aren't even aware of and or would actively avoid if we did know about them. It's a mix of travelogue and nature writing. And Cal Flyn, our speaker today, it was such a delight to read your book. Actually, I listened to it on audiobook, which was beautiful, and I recommend everyone do the same because there's this poetry to it that just deserves to be spoken aloud. I wanted to start today by talking about this word island that's in your title. What I love about it is that you don't mean it literally, you mean it in the abstract. Some of your locations are literally islands, but many of them are have become islands in the sense that they are spaces separated from the rest of human activity. And what it brings to mind also, I think that your previous book was a historical book. And looking at this from the prehistorical and then the historical lens, islands used to be where humans were. Places of activity used to be where humans carved out for ourselves spaces to be comfortable in. And we have now inversed it. The world is overcome by humans and our activity and our intentions and our unintentions. And there are now these islands of space that we have polluted so much or left to the degree where we aren't comfortable with them anymore, or we're not supposed to go there. So we've retreated from them. And when we dare to think of them, it's almost like looking at these cancerous tumors. So in your journey for this book, you dare to examine them, to visit them and crack them open for us, which brings a possibility of something to be learned or even something to be hopeful about. And I want to know first how that's felt to be out front, like shining the torch into places where others don't even want to look.
Well, thank you. That's a very generous read of the book. Thank you very much. And yeah, as you say, Islands of Abandonment is about islands, both literal and metaphorical. I look at abandoned places, a series of them, 13 of them around the world, in which humans have been gone for decades. And I look at how nature has been rebounding in that time. And yeah, this idea of the island, it is a very powerful one in ecology. Often they talk about metaphorical islands, and it's this sense of having islands of particular habitat. So that might be a literal archipelago in the sea, and islands, which, as you know, has been such a crucible for evolution and for human development too, and also for islands of habitats surrounded by human development. So here in Europe, often it is so heavily developed that abandoned places are actually kind of the wildest places that we have in some countries. So what I was really interested in was finding these sort of discrete environments in which sort of natural rules are now in play and have been for some time, just to see how they have developed and see the sort of cascading effects of human activity, how it continues to spool out, you know, many years after we've gone. And I think it was important to come to your point about sort of I suppose looking out with a torch. I love that image. It was important for me to go to dark places looking for hope. I think for many of us who are environmentally concerned, it's kind of a dark time. I think it can be quite difficult to keep reading the news every day and feel hope for the world. And in fact, as I kept finding, there are these incredible redemption stories happening all around us every day. And often what that has required is for us to withdraw and for us to sort of almost hand over the reins to nature and hand over ever more land. So as we're finding in Europe, in North America, in East Asia, there is a huge amount of land falling into abandonment, often farmland, especially marginal farmland that has been degraded and then abandoned. And often in those places, they're becoming reforested and on a grand scale. And it is, I think, going to be one of our saving graces and one of our great sources for sort of biodiversity and carbon sinking and all of this kind of thing for the future.
The thing that I wonder about language and the English language is the way that we talk about these things, the way that our vocabulary and sure what it implies how we think about things. And the word nature itself is I think awkward because we talk about it as another, whereas we are human bodies and selves are a product of nature, are an expression of nature, are part of nature. And so there's sometimes this sense of like, well, we're destroying nature, or there's a sense of like we're destroying something, but maybe nature will survive anyway. And it fragments it. Because aren't we nature after all? Aren't we this sort of creative and destructive and the only self-reflective part of nature? How do you balance that when you're out there in these spaces? What do you think about that? Because it seems like this artificial separation in our minds.
Yeah, that's a great question because I think that's very much the point, I guess, I was come around to make in the book, you know, which is that humans are a force of nature as well. It's not helpful to think of us as being completely separate to the rest of the world. In fact, it is kind of, I don't know, I've started thinking of it as being quite sort of arrogant of us to think of us as being outside of nature. And I think one of the ways in which you can see that at work is how, if you look at forces of succession, which is how foliage or undergrowth begins to sort of take over abandoned land, especially land that's been completely like razed to the ground. The way that happens is exactly the same way as, for example, a volcanic island might slowly be colonized by plants over time. And what I began to realize was that, you know, nature has all of the tools to react to human damage. And the reason it does is because our damage is kind of equivalent to many other kinds of natural damage. So if you look at sort of volcanoes, earthquakes, all sorts of huge types of disasters, the way that the Earth responds is kind of the same. I suppose the what we get hung up about, the reason that we think of ourselves as separate to nature is the sheer scale at which humans are sort of wreaking havoc upon other species around the world. And I think probably the best way to think about it, if you're of a sort of ecological mindset, is to think of us as being like hyper keystone species, you know, like we really have an outsized influence on the rest of the world. But we certainly are part of nature. And I think that if we really believed that and understood that and tried to imagine how we fit in with all the other species around us, almost collegiately that would help us live in the world.
Yeah, like I think the first example of that keystone species thing comes from tracing when humans migrated to different parts of the world and when by seeing when the megafauna died, right? So we've been doing that for a really long time. We've been changing the world and sort of taking over from other species that were dominant until that time. And then seems like there's also this fallacy that nature is wildness and then human space is human space, but there are so many layers in between. And there have been for as long as we've been around, it seems like, right? Like the gardening of the Amazon. The Amazon wasn't just a jungle, it was like there were people living there and having villages there or not having villages, and they were cultivating and thinning, or all kinds of interventions. And in Bali, it's really apparent because one of the most beloved parts of nature here is the rice terraces, which are actually deforested land that have become agriculture in a wonderful, gorgeous way that we appreciate and that feeds us. So there's all of these layers to it. And I imagine that when you're in these, like, in the spaces that you've traveled to, that you come up against that and you see them as they're being dismantled, as they're changing, not necessarily back to something, but like into something else.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think that idea of transition is very important in the book. And like, yeah, what you said there really touched on something that I feel strongly about, which is often when we look at landscapes, we bring quite a lot of sort of cultural baggage with us. Like, especially, I mean, I know here in the UK, when we look at abandoned land, people get sort of like itchy about it, like they don't like it, and they don't like these sort of feral assemblages of plants that start growing up. But actually, so-called brownfield sites, so these are like formerly developed sites which are now derelict, have proven to be some of the most biodiverse, most ecologically valuable sites that we have. And that's because of that sense of transition. So you have lots of different species sort of arrive and start scrabbling around trying to make it. And then you have I suppose the foliage, which starts kind of succeeding. And so you've got lots of different habitats all in one place. And so in terms of biodiversity, it's kind of amazing. It's not a stable ecosystem in the way that either, like quote unquote pristine forest might be. It's also not a stable ecosystem like the rice terraces might be, because they've been like that for a long time, and the species that live there are well adapted to living there alongside humans. So it is somewhere in between, and it is quite like a sort of wild, almost like random place in terms of what species can make it there. And it is, yeah, that sort of like, I don't know, they're just amazing places where you sense that the control of man sort of withdrawing. And then if there's a power vacuum, other species come to the fore and kind of battle it out, really. So it made me start looking at the world around me in a very different way, which was almost like I can see all the different species almost like land grabbing and trying to make new homes and make the most of the opportunity that a landscape in transition offers them.
It actually makes me think about the way people talk about what we're starting to understand about the microbiome and this appreciation for variety and wildness and like exposure to dirt and to the world. So like, is this a new phase for humans where we can go back to like appreciating complexity and recognizing that?
Yeah, I hope so. Certainly, there's a lot of really exciting science going on at the moment in these, like, what I call the post-human landscape. So there's a lot more respect for this idea of the sort of derelict or brownfield site, and they're becoming much more valued. So we're seeing a cultural shift in that way. In Europe in the 17th century, we had very negative views of wetlands or marshes, bogs, whatever. Like, often those were called very explicitly on the map wastelands, and the the wasteland of the 17th century is now one of our most valued ecosystems now, because we're very concerned about all the species that live there, and we've come to realize that peatlands, bogs, wetlands, and so on are really, really, really valuable. And so I think a similar shift, like an analogous shift, is happening now with these man-impacted environments, not only in terms of biodiversity, but in recognizing the value of recovered forest. So this will be a big issue in Indonesia, because of course there's been a lot of deforestation over years, but after some time, if they fall into disuse, often that's because of degraded soils and so on, the rainforest can move back in. And so we see that in the Amazon, we're seeing that in places like Indonesia, when the forest is regrowing. We call that secondary forest, but actually that forest is a lot more valuable than it sounds like when you say it's sort of degraded forest or something like that. The way that we talk about it makes it sound less important than it is.
Yeah, my friend Arifra Bick is looking at how to replant parts of Indonesia in a sort of agroforestry system, because bamboo is known for being one of those keystones. I don't know if the word's keystone, but one of those species that show up first, pioneer species. It will grow and find a way everywhere, and as it does that, it will like attract water to that place. It will fill the soil with water. But he brings it into a more complex layer of not just planting bamboo. It's actually really important to consider what other species and crops can come into play in the understory, and that will create just like mutual health for the plants in the system, and also for the people involved that want to benefit and benefit off of it, rely on it, to just create this. It just feels like sort of a web of life that is so much healthier than this sort of monoculture perspective that we so often have. It's just amazing to see it on both ends, on like the parallel of like reforesting or regrowing after a human-made catastrophe, and then regrowing after a volcano. It's true, there are parallels there, but also like there's an unknown frontier of the chemicals that we have pulled out of the soil or created and unleashed. And there was that tension there. Were you afraid for yourself? Were you cautious in these places? How did those dynamics work? I keep remembering, especially in places like the Chernobyl part, like you were walking around breathing that air, talking to people and seeing animals and.
Yeah, so to talk, for people who haven't read the book, I can talk through a few of the landscapes. So I went to Chernobyl. Actually, this was the first place that I visited, because it seemed to me to sort of embody the phenomenon I was interested in. It is quite a famous example of the sort of people leave and nature returns kind of narrative. And what I found in Chernobyl was really interesting, which is that this huge area has been excluded to humans. It's fenced off. A very small number of people live in a huge area, not only in Ukraine, but across the border in Belarus. And this area was very badly contaminated during and after the meltdown in 1986. But what has happened in the intervening decades is that the various radioactive elements decay at different rates, and the ones that we were most worried about at the time of the nuclear disaster are no longer the ones that we're most worried about now, because of their rate of decay. It means that they've sort of basically slid from view. They still exist, but in much attenuated form. So, for example, radioactive iodine, that's the one that we as humans were most worried about, because it lodges in our thyroid gland, and it gives like thyroid cancer. That is now much lower. Levels throughout the zone are much lower, but we have much sort of more longer lasting forms of contamination, different radioactive elements basically, and they hang around in slightly different patterns all over the zone. And so some areas of the zone which used to be dangerous are not as dangerous anymore, and other areas of the zone remain incredibly dangerous, but you wouldn't want to hang out there for long. They're not dangerous to pass through temporarily. And the reactor itself, recently they covered it over with a new sort of metal skeleton, essentially, to stop the worst escaping. That the previous one had been sort of degenerating over years and leaking, so it was a bit of a disaster. So in Chernobyl, you can enter reasonably easily now because of those sort of reduced radiation levels. So I went to the zone and spent, I guess, just short of 48 hours there. I stayed overnight. There's a small guest house if you want to stay. And what I was surprised about was how many people I did see, because the nuclear plant is still being sort of wound down, and it will be decommissioned over a period of years. And there are also a small number, I mean, a few dozen scattered throughout hundreds of villages, of people who lived in Chernobyl at the time of the accident, had nothing to do with the plant, and lost their homes, were rehomed in Kiev, mainly in sort of like high-rise blocks, that kind of thing. Couldn't adapt. They tended to be sort of farmers or farmers' wives, and then they basically broke back into the zone and have been living there. And so I think that feeling of seeing people in places like this who live there, who are there so much longer than I was, made me sort of think quite a lot about perceived risk and how different it can be to actual risk. And I think it was a good place for me to go early on, because it made me think about that a lot. For them, their exposure is low but chronic, and there's a huge amount of controversy over what that does, not only to a person but to the other species within the zone. So there are some American scientists who are extremely concerned about this, like chronic radiation. They've come up with all sorts of studies to show that leaf litter is not decomposing, that various species can handle it, and generally the sort of more mainstream scientific community feel that there is there's kind of optimism. Is not that the species are not being impacted over time, but that it's not so much that it stops them from breeding. And so I think that was a useful exercise for me to think about, because later I would go to places like I went to Paterson, New Jersey, and the Newark Harbor, where I was writing about these so-called persistent organic pollutants. So these are like very, very toxic chemicals that were produced during the 19th century for things like hat making. A lot of these things were just dumped over the side, and they got into the bay and have been flooding the base of the harbor. So it is there. The problem is much more sort of intense and acute, because the very small amounts of these chemicals can cause a great deal of damage. So I think having sort of run those risks in my head in Chernobyl, it helped me understand the different risks in different places. And in France, in Verdun, I went to a place where there was a clearing in the woods. Basically, they burned a lot of chemical weapons after the First World War. And then all these heavy metals had leached into the soil. It was stopping things growing. And I don't know, madly saw a hole in the fence and sort of crawled in under it. I thought it was important just to feel the place. I don't know, if you go all the way somewhere and then you see a hole in the fence, you're like, oh God, I'm going to have to go in. So I went in, and I think like, I'm fine, but almost at some stage you sort of throw caution to the wind and hope. And in many other ways, I think that actually the psychology of these places was much more challenging to me. So this idea of trespass, of I don't know, going against the rules somehow was very difficult to do, and much more so than dealing with any physical risk. It was this sort of fear that can seize you, when you know that you're doing wrong. So like the first time I sort of broke into an old building, I remember just being like completely, almost like paralyzed by anxiety. And then over practice, you get used to it, and either you realize that if you get caught, it's not the end of the world, or you're not going to get caught, you know. And for me, that was at least as much of a sort of psychological reckoning as dealing with any physical risk. No, I've lost her. I'll keep talking a little bit about when I went to France, because that was an interesting example. I went to yes, this area which is near Verdun, and so this was a very intense area of fighting during the First World War, and the ground was so torn up with shelling, even like human skeletons, all of this. It looked like a moonscape completely. And it so much so that after that, hi, Laura, I'm just talking a little bit about Verdun while the connection sorts out.
I'm back.
Great. Okay, good. I was just saying that in Verdun in France, there was a great deal of damage to the landscape. And so what they did there was just they planted forests over the most damaged area of ground and basically fenced it off and forbade people from going there. And they call it the Zone Rouge. And so a lot of the Zone Rouge gets smaller and smaller. But there's still this area of like forbidden forest, and it's quite a strange sort of like living sarcophagus of all the problems essentially left by the World War.
It's just amazing to hear about sort of all of these situations where, like in some cases they can be fenced off, they can be controlled to some degree. In other cases, they're just too big, you couldn't even try. In some cases, you feel like, well, they should clean it up, but actually cleaning it up would create more destruction and like unearth and release things that we don't know how to contain, that hopefully maybe someday we will know how to contain and leave it for then. And then there's also this, like you say, this sort of psychogeography of it where people want to do what they want to do, and sometimes they need to do what they need to do. So they're eating the sea creatures in the place where the signs say that they must not, that it's dangerous, and then they eat them once or twice and they're still okay. So it seems okay. Like human memory and human relationship to place is so strong. If you've been sent off your farmland to live in some skyrise, like it's kind of worth it sometimes to just like go and live, and maybe you'll get sick sooner than you would have otherwise. But there's like everyone, all the individuals involved are balancing all these trade-offs, including you. Like, how much of the time were you like you had to research and get permission and go in a controlled way? And how much of the time were you just sort of climbing under fences and seeing if you could get away with it? And how did that like color how you experienced each place? And then after that, I want you to read the quote that you mentioned.
Yeah, actually, that's a great question, because I do think that that experience, the way that I approached the different places, definitely had a huge impact on like the way that I felt them and experienced them and so on. And it was really important for me in this book to get that sense of atmosphere, and sort of in a sense, the ones where I just had to sort of turn up, I almost felt more keenly, but it wasn't always possible that way. So in Cyprus, what happened? So I went to Cyprus because I was interested in no man's lands, because this is something that it's a sort of documented phenomenon, which is that where we have these long stalemates in warfare, often the area that's the no man's land becomes this safe haven for wildlife, weirdly. So this has we first it was first sort of scientifically recognized in the records of Lewis and Clark, who moved through North America at a time when it was very dominated by Native American peoples, and they soon realized that the regions between warring Native American nations, which served as a sort of buffer zone, were absolutely full of things like bison and deer and so on, like really beautiful beavers and so on. They're very rich, and we've also seen that in the former Cold War, the Iron Curtain. We see that today in Korea, they have the demilitarized zone, which has become sort of famous for having, well, some big cats and certainly migratory birds and smaller mammals. And in Cyprus, which is where I went. So I had to arrange to meet someone who could take me through the various checkpoints. I tried to arrange to go directly into the zone through the UN, but unfortunately the political situation there kind of moved quite quickly, so they had to stop accepting applications. So I turned up with my guide, and essentially he was like, okay, I want to show you something. And then we just drove past all the signs saying no man's land, don't go, mind, and so on. And then we just went down a track to go look at a church that he remembered from his childhood. And then we got sort of chased back out again by the UN because we were in the no man's land. So I think those kind of experiences are very important to how you experience a place. In Montserrat, which is an island in the Caribbean, their former capital city has been completely flooded by volcanic flows. So Plymouth is kind of no more. Certainly the center of town is under sort of 3 stories worth of ash, which is formed solidly like concrete. There, because I don't know, for access reasons, I did arrange an official guide. I went with a guide, and we also have to have a police presence with you when you go into the zone. They divide the islands into different sort of zones of danger, and to get into zone V, which is in the path of the volcano, you need to go in and take all sorts of secure approaches. So you leave the car on, running, pointing in the direction of the exit, all of that kind of thing, just in case the volcano happens to sort of grumble into life. So yeah, I think in those places where I did take a more sort of official route, it does affect the way that you experience them. I think they just feel safer because they have this veneer of respectability over the top of them, or admin or something like that. But most of them I basically just turned up. These abandoned sites are often unpoliced. They might be fenced, but usually people don't care that much. If they were that valuable, probably they would stop people coming into them. And abandoned places, almost by definition, are quite ephemeral. So there were a number of places that I tried to go to that I'd seen images of or had heard rumors about, and when I got there, no longer existed or had been redeveloped, something like that. So it is, I think it's important to go to these places in person. Often there's not a lot of up-to-date information out there, and you don't really know what you're going to get until you go there. So a lot of the time I just turned up just to see.
It's amazing the transitory nature of some of them. And also, while you're being there, imagining them at a different time, imagining them when they sort of, the turning point happened where they became, where they had reason to be abandoned. So all of the layers of imagination. And I was so fascinated to read that your previous book, Thicker Than Water, was dealing with this colonialism in Australia and intergenerational guilt. That just fast forwarded me into like 100 or 200 years from now, and the degree to which we will judge what we're doing now and how we're treating space now and how we're making decisions at the moment. Can you imagine fast forwarding yourself into the future and looking back at the intergenerational guilt that we might be experiencing as a society now?
Yeah, I think the more I learn about history, and I honestly don't know how anyone can study history and not feel this, which is that history teaches you that in the present moment, you almost never have a good moral sense of what you're doing. Everything is so tinged by, culturally relevant sort of ways of thinking, and it's very difficult to take yourself out of what's kind of the norm and look at it critically. And definitely I realized that when I was writing about the early days of Australia. Very strangely, so I looked at a distant relative of mine called Angus Macmillan, who was an early explorer, and he was a very sort of pious, well-meaning young man who went to Australia to make a new life for himself, and within 5 years was apparently leading massacres of Aboriginal people. I can't bring myself to believe that he didn't at some level know that this was wrong, but in the way of the time they spoke about it almost as like he was a hero, right? He was exploring new ground. He was claiming land for white people, essentially, although they didn't put it exactly in those terms. And so I think that what I can take from that is that the way that we can think about how we deal with the world around us, we can hold many truths in our brains at once, and often we choose to believe what our society around us agrees with us. We all find these sort of weird norms and we go along with them. And I think, yeah, to some extent, the way that we deal, especially with questions of climate change and, just generally the way that we look at the natural world, I think is also kind of odd. We often talk about being like stewards of the planet and so on, and it's very self-righteous and self-aggrandizing. So I think, to me, I sort of assume that over time we're going to become, I used that word collegiate before, and I think that that's definitely the way to go forward. All the time we're sort of realizing that the species around us have much better cognitive powers than we have previously ascribed them, and that they kind of know better than us what they want to do and how they want to go about it. And so I think there is going to be some sense in which we have to accept the self-determination of the plants and animals and so on, and try and be less hands-on when it comes to questions of conservation. Because I know that when you work in conservation, everyone in conservation wants to do the best thing, right? Everyone is there for good reasons. The problem is that we don't always know what the best thing to do is, and that, I think, is the great sort of ethical quandary at the heart of it. That's why we have so many different competing environmental philosophies, and not all of them are going to work, and it's very difficult to predict which ones are going to happen. So I think possibly, I'm on one side just voicing, being like, well, have you thought about handing over more control? Not because I think that's the only way to approach our relationship with the wild. There are some harmful things that we've done that hopefully can be undone. So it's not always that we should take a hands-off approach, but I think we do have to very carefully balance how much, you touched on this earlier, like how much damage we do when we're trying to fix something. So for example, if we dredge a harbor to get rid of harmful toxins, but that means stripping the environment back to zero and starting afresh, is that the right trade-off? If we're talking about invasive species, is it the right thing for us to charge into, in my book, I talk about cloud forests in Tanzania, but this will also be the same in forests in Indonesia, which is that these invasive species that are, from human sources, basically, we've spread them around the world. Is the best thing for us to do is to go and rip them out, or do we accept that the ecosystems around us are quote unquote impure and less like they were before human impact? It's very hard line to draw, but I think that that's why I'm interested in it, in these sort of contested landscapes or conflicted landscapes. Sorry, I sort of drifted from your question.
No, but it's just amazing to actually, it's amazing to consider, like, as a human with an ego, to just consider like the point about how much we actually don't know, and recognizing that we don't have all the answers, we don't know.
Right.
And the approaches, so many of the approaches that we take this century, like even antibiotics, like save people's lives, so yay, but they sort of, in a sort of stripping everything away. Chemotherapy just strips everything away in order to kill what's bad. And short of having the right kind of sniper to just kill the stuff that's harmful and let the rest of it be, that's been our approach. So there's just, it's just so much tied up in the way that we approach the environment is, and our bodies and our different kinds of our different ways of interacting with the world and creating technologies to do so. I hope that we're at a shift of considering the complexity outside of the specialization, of knitting people together, different specialists together, different trains of thought together. It's amazing as a writer that you get to do that through like deep diving into something for a few years and putting it together for the rest of us and bringing it back to spread it around. I
I want to take a second to make sure that we read the quote that you brought up and have the chance to touch on it, because I just think that you have the most wonderful and poetic way of sharing like very specific practical scientific information and bringing it into and bring it to the rest of us to take farther. So go for it.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. I thought I'd read a section. So when I talk about the book, I often describe it as being a book about the ecology and the psychology of abandoned places. And I thought I might quote a little bit from my chapter about Paterson, New Jersey, which is obviously a city. I went to a couple of cities which are marked by dereliction or areas of abandonment. Paterson, New Jersey has a very large industrial complex at its heart that dates back from the industrial age. And it has become sort of people by what you might call sort of people of the margins. So people who choose to go to these burnt out, overgrown factories for one reason or another. And I was interested in why we are attracted to places like this. What's the appeal of the abandoned place? Because often sort of thrill seekers will find themselves going there. They frighten us, and abandoned places come with all sorts of negative impacts on the human brain. They're often linked to things like poor mental health, poor physical health, and so on. Definitely linked to high levels of crime, but also there's this attraction. So I'll just read a little section from here. In an urban environment, entering an abandoned space is the nearest thing we have to stepping off the map. It offers anonymity, the succor of green space without the order, the omnipresence of man so implicit in the park or garden. An urban ruin might offer an effect upon the mind akin to slipping into the dark forest or scaling a rugged peak, that same wild element, and we might seek it out for similar reasons. Amidst the crumbling mills and towering blackened chimneys, skeletal remains of industrial giants, I feel a flickering, a stirring of the soul. The shadow of the sublime passes overhead. Seen through this prism, the drugs baggies, the bloodied needles, the spray-painted trees, even the grimy encampments could be symbols not of a community in decline, but of an extreme anarchic liberty. What Anais Nin said, in chaos there is fertility. There is more than one kind of freedom, as Aunt Lydia tells her captive audience in Margaret Atwood's A Handmaid's Tale, freedom to and freedom from. In their new theocratic state of Gilead, the apprentice handmaidens are being given freedom from objectification, freedom from certain kinds of danger. In the days of anarchy, as Lydia calls them, meaning the before times, now, it was freedom too. I have never seen the latter so clearly epitomized as in the unkempt wilderness grown up around the old Colt Mill. It is an instantly comprehensible demonstration, a defining of terms. There is no authority here to defy. To be here is to experience a raw kind of exhilaration laced with fear. There is a thrill in finding safe passage through a place with no safety rail, empowerment in the experience of self-determination in the extreme. But without the structure and strictures of normal society, the sense of possibility is so strong as to be dizzying. I could do anything, you think. I could be anyone, and no one will stop me. One realizes very quickly how thin the threads that hold our identities in place might be. Perhaps we only know who we truly are in a place where no one tells us what to do.
Thank you so much, Cal. That was beautiful. Because I mean, with all of this, it just comes back to our own perspective, and the world is experienced through the eyes of each of us and created through all of our intentions. And I found it just beautifully hopeful. And I know that it's important to talk about that hopefulness in context of the responsibility of recognizing that a lot of action does need to happen to stop creating this kind of destruction and then to recover this kind of destruction. But in the midst of that, being able to just imagine these spaces, having had the light shone onto these spaces, I never thought about the borders between countries or the borders between warring tribes in the Americas, the things that happen in the spaces where we aren't, and what does happen when we aren't there. is just a shift in that perspective. And I really appreciate that sense of hope and possibility. So thank you for being here today and talking to us all, and for writing such a beautiful book. I can't wait to see where you go next and what you create next, what adventures you have to take in order to get there.
That's very kind of you. Thank you, Laura.
So in closing, we want to thank you for supporting the Yayasan Mudra Swati Saraswati's Patrons Program, and to the festival's partners who made the Ubud Readers and Writers Festival possible this year. Thank you.
Thank you.